Okay, so what I want to talk about today is to pull together, build on top of last week, and very specifically talk about working with symptoms and how flares might actually be something that can be useful, as opposed to just something that causes suffering and pain and fear that we experience. And I'm going to take a look with one case example, and we're going to take a look at triggers and how that links to trauma. So just as very brief, so we're all on the same page, last week was really talking about how the onset trigger, the experience that happens right before the onset of a chronic illness, whether it's in the months before, the weeks, or the year, the onset trigger is not the cause, but actually more the last straw. And in that, it really begins to highlight from the research that the last straw is that the volcano that I think of as chronic illness is something that's been developing over a long time, years, often decades, according to antibody studies, which is one of the things that have been really helpful from some of the studies in autoimmune diseases. And the link that I've been focusing on, certainly there are all kinds of environmental risk factors, but the link has been the role of trauma and adversity and how that builds up over time to influence the nervous system and nervous system perceptions of threat. And that is what is driving symptoms as a nervous system issue rather than or before it actually becomes a tissue issue, which is how I've begun to think about chronic illness. I'm going to do one case example. I had been hoping to do two, but I couldn't fit that in. And Ami Quiriconi has rheumatoid arthritis, and she is a businesswoman and a mother, and she's really loved sports all her life. And when she developed RA, that put a really big dent in her ability to be really active. And Ami developed RA in her 40s, and she was able to get diagnosed in a year. I know a lot of you here it's taken, and it's so common that it takes longer than that. But when she was diagnosed, she was negative rheumatoid factor, but had a really high marker of inflammation with her anti-CCP. And as she developed the RA and was living with that, she ended up getting really curious. Am I going to be on medications for my whole life? Is there nothing that I can do other than that medical model? And she was looking around, she started learning about trauma. And one of them was that she found my website and the role of trauma in chronic illness. And we ended up doing a podcast together. She had a podcast herself. And part of her learning about trauma was starting trauma therapy and then developing curiosity about triggers and flares. And this is the cover that she designed for the interview that she hosted with me that she shared. And Charmaine, I'll be sending you the link. You have the link for I have a detailed blog post that shares clues about working with triggers and flares. But I'll send this to you also, a link to the YouTube video and the podcast if anyone's interested in that. And so just to summarize sort of where Ami went with this was that it was really about learning how to listen to her body, which is something a lot of us with chronic illness had to, at some level, override in childhood. And we do that in this culture also. And she started learning really how to feel her feelings, anger being one of them, and being able to acknowledge that and then use that anger to set boundaries. And part of that ended up being including herself in her priorities, which is also something that a lot of us with chronic illness have overridden and have had to learn how to do. And one of the big decisions she made was to leave an abusive partner. And this whole process took many years. It wasn't an overnight thing, but it made a huge change, including being able to make the decision to change doctors to someone who was more attuning and more wanting to work with her as a team. And changing doctors is often something we've had to do. It's often repeating an attachment experience that we may have had in our own childhood, not being seen or believed. So she made that change, stopped a medication, cut another one in half, and gradually her inflammation had decreased. Somewhere in there, I think her rheumatoid factor must have become positive, and that stayed positive, at least for a while. But with the work she did with the trauma, she, at least for quite a period of time, stopped having flares and was able to go back to sports. And so I use her example to highlight how the trauma perspective can help go in this direction. So some of the tips to this process of working with symptoms are working with flares. And so Ami had had a flare-up of her wrist pain. And in working with flares, if we're thinking about trauma and we have a really high index of suspicion, we can look for triggers for those flares. And I don't know if that's something that's common in your own work, in your own perspectives, but triggers tend to happen before flares, and they're often very sneaky. Some of them will be overt, just like onset triggers can be, but a lot of them, and I've been doing this work with my own chronic fatigue symptoms for 25 years, and I am still surprised at how sneaky they are. And that's partly because they're linked to trauma, and they're linked to experiences in the past that our systems have had to repress or suppress. And so they're not in our cognitive awareness. So tips for looking for triggers, other than preceding a flare, is that if you're in a flare and you're looking for that trigger, one of them can be looking for some strong feeling or even an overreaction to a small or seemingly small event that's not your usual everyday baseline. And it could be a spike of fear or helplessness or rage. I remember when I was in my medical training, stubbing my toe at one point, and I wanted to kill someone. That was the level of energy I had, which is definitely an overreaction. And I didn't have health issues at that point, but it kind of spoke to an underlying state in my own system of being pretty maxed out. So that can be a clue to look for what caused the anger, what might be underlying that rage or driving it. And then another one that we'll talk about what Ami ended up doing is working with sensation or curiosity around the flare-up itself. So one of the things that Ami noticed was that her flare-up with her wrist pain had happened after a first date. And she got really curious about what might have been the trigger in that experience with this first date. And when we're looking for triggers, they may or may not be stressful. They may be something linked to, let's say, a traumatic event. If you've had an accident, for example, and a red car was involved, and maybe it's in a location nearby, and maybe you avoid that location a lot of the time, and this flare-up happens when you had just walked through or gone by that location, or someone had walked by in a red sweater. It can be really subtle. And so holding that place of curiosity can really help. And these aspects of a trigger are also really present for resources. If you know that you're at risk of getting a flare, as you start to do this work, and you probably already know a lot of the things that are triggers for your flares, you can resource yourself or do things that are actually helpful. It could be bringing something colorful or wearing something that actually feels resourcing to you. So it goes both ways, which is really helpful to know. And as a trigger detective, curiosity is a really big piece because it tends to come with non-judgment and self-compassion, or compassion, a place that we can find in ourselves that has compassion for the painful part in our body. a lot of times we really get angry or frustrated with our bodies and how it feels as though our bodies are failing us. But getting curious instead about what might be the intelligence in the system, in the symptom itself, can also be really helpful. So this sense of looking at a sensation, listening, and having this attitude with the self-compassion can really help. So what Ami noticed, and this exploration, this exercise of being present with a flare-up is often something that can be helpful with another person there. Often what I think of as a trauma therapist who is able to help us regulate around something that often is like that volcano. It represents something underneath it that may be pretty intense. And so in this example, what she noticed as she was paying attention to her wrist was that it seemed as though the sensation came from her chest area, and that it seemed kind of linked to a fight response or to a sensation she might have before a fight. And that the sensation, as she stayed curious, seemed to go down her arms to her wrists and then her hands. And so that's kind of an interesting discovery in a way, to see what a symptom may link to and how much bigger it may be than just the flare itself. And part of this question, this exploration, then was, and this is also where having a trauma therapist can be helpful, is what do you do with that information? In this case, one of the questions could be, is there an impulse in this series of sensations? And for Ami, there was a very clear impulse, and she noticed that she really just wanted to punch a hole in a wall. And when we think about that, that's a pretty strong, clear impulse, and very much a fight response. And triggers tend to be related to past trauma. So having a fight response from the past or a flight response, those are actually kind of interesting because they're not linked to helplessness. And helplessness is something we talked about last week as being a component of an experience that differentiates trauma from stress. It's an event that we individually experience that triggers helplessness in us because we have no other option or no way out or no way through. So to feel a fight response linked to a symptom is actually an indication that something potentially healing, something potentially more whole, something that has been thwarted potentially for decades is making itself known. And often when you're exploring somatically, not cognitively, not trying to think your way through because you actually can't figure out trauma, it's really held in the body. It's that when you're exploring this, you can actually be really surprised at what shows up. And the surprise component tells you, that's part of what tells you that you're on the right track. You're not making something up. So when Ami kind of looked at her anger and got curious about the anger and what had arisen, she was really aware how this was not a feeling that was allowed in her family growing up, or that was safe to express when she was growing up. And that, if you live in that kind of setting for years, 18 years, 15 years, however long in your childhood, and it could be shorter as an adult that you go through that, those experiences where you can't actually express yourself, especially if it's something that might be helpful to defend yourself, those can lead to a freeze response. And so that stuffing of the anger is not a conscious thing. It's actually something that our nervous systems and our bodies will do just to help us with survival. So these feelings, another reason to explore these with a therapist, at least in the beginning, while you're developing tools and skills that you can then later use on your own, is that the feelings that we can encounter when we're exploring a sensation can be kind of scary. And that's if you haven't had the experience of being able to be angry or having support for that, or having conflict maybe in a family setting with one of your adult caregivers as a kid, where it was okay and it actually led to resolution. If none of that happened, and kids, as kids, our nervous systems really need co-regulation from the adults around us because we're not wired to do this regulation by ourselves. So that's part of how all kinds of emotions can actually be overwhelming when we come in contact with them. And so knowing that we bump into something that's scary is, again, just letting us know we're tapping into something linked to old traumas. And this is part of how we begin to touch into it to work through it. As she got more clear and me was able to look back on that first date and say, okay, there were some things going on with this guy. One is that he was abusive in these really subtle ways, such as making her wrong, being kind of controlling, and even lying in a way just to make himself look better. And what she realized was that this was also very familiar to her. And as I mentioned earlier, she ended up leaving an abusive relationship. And that this was perhaps more subtle, but red flags were what showed up with this for her. And if you're thinking in this bigger picture of trauma, this suggests that she may have grown up in a family setting where abuse was the norm and where she, therefore, her nervous system had to suppress that if anger and fighting her way out or protecting herself weren't options, and that became normalized. And so then we can become blind to noticing certain patterns in our current day relationships, such as this. So with that knowledge, through that sensation and that essentially what can happen in a trauma therapy session or when we're working with trauma, she slowed down to really listen what her body was saying. And essentially that wanting to punch the hole in the wall is what the child might want to do or the adolescent might want to do. And that she as an adult did not. She did not need to use physical force. And as she paid attention, she could feel that, oh, I can say no to this person. And so she decided not to date him and her flare improved, which is really pretty cool and exciting. And I've had some similar situations myself where a flare can really resolve quite quickly. And sometimes it can last for quite a while. But that message is actually conveying something new to the brain that is caught in a helplessness freeze perception of threat. When you access the survival response that couldn't happen in trauma, it could even be something as, let's just call it simple as the impulse of your arms, this impulse for a movement of your arms to turn like this. This could have been the impulse to turn the steering wheel in the car that could have gotten you out of the way if you'd had time. And when we access and complete those actions or feel those feelings and set that boundary or complete the escape or the fight, it communicates to the nervous system that you succeeded, you escaped, and that it's over. It then actually turns the signaling, the danger, the threat signaling in your brain off and tells your nervous system that you survived. And that's what freeze does, is it blocks that message. Those of us who end up with symptoms that are trauma related, it's because the nervous system never got that message. So really, this may not and was not for me possible in the past to be angry, to say no, to set a boundary. And that's what has often happened for many of us. And in this situation as adults now with a chronic illness, it's often a very different setting or situation. There can be much more possibility, more support, can be asking for support as an adult. And so working with trauma healing as an adult is partly working with that younger child part in us that did not have that support. And that's part of how we can work through that trauma. So working through all this is a way of integrating trauma and reconnecting parts of ourselves that got disconnected, because essentially trauma disconnects us from ourselves, from our bodies, from our feelings. So when I think about flares, actually this just came in preparing the talk for today, was that chronic illness ultimately may just be one big flare. When we look at this layout here of the volcano is really when, in my mind, when a chronic illness becomes fully sort of installed, present every day, the new baseline. But often for many of us, if we look back, we'll have had a few flares that came, we weren't quite sure what it was. Maybe we have pain in the wrist, like for what happened for me at one point. She thought maybe it's because I overdid it or I hurt myself. And then it goes away and you forget about it, which is a really healthy, normal thing. And then maybe there's a little flare, but that ultimately chronic illness may be made up of this ongoing perception of threat that's driving symptoms day to day. And if we look at it that place from that perspective and what might be possible when working with flares, how much is possible is really the question of returning that huge volcano that's the baseline, going back down, decreasing the flares, decreasing the frequency of them, because we're working through the triggers and the unprocessed trauma. And it raises the question of how much is possible to return the baseline to the point where we're no longer highly symptomatic or overtly symptomatic, or having fewer flares, or as in Ami's case, not having flares. And so reversing the volcano may really be linked to changing the brain's perception of threat. So part of working with triggers is looking for patterns. What are your own unique patterns, such as Ami's pattern of perhaps being drawn to partners who are potentially abusive because that's what she knew and what her system was familiar with? The patterns are completely different for each one of us, and they might even be different for different kinds of flares. So part of the looking for patterns can be getting to know or acknowledge or recognize events that we've had in our past that were actually traumatic, but that may have been normalized. So when Ami was looking back at her own experiences in babyhood, she was an unplanned pregnancy. Her mom had smoked, which is associated, it's a known association with rheumatoid arthritis. But also when we think about that, her mom being only 19, smoking is a way that many people cope with emotions or overwhelm that has been suppressed or repressed. It's really been linked to past trauma. It's a coping mechanism a lot of the time, as a way to think about this, reflecting her mom's own potential history of trauma in the past. And there was also prenatal stress. So those are things I talked about last week that are linked to risk for autoimmune diseases and other chronic illnesses. In her childhood, Ami's mother ended up leaving when she was really young still. And her father, his own evidence of his own past trauma was his overuse of alcohol and the fact that he was abusive. And all of these components lead to something that I think of as an invisible ACE, an invisible adverse childhood experiences of emotional neglect. When our parents are overwhelmed from their own unresolved trauma and they're unable to connect emotionally or be supportive emotionally, that I think is one of the most important risk factors in chronic illness that I've been seeing with people who are taking surveys on my blog and in the work I've done as a trauma therapist. So this also means, these two periods of life means also that Ami has an adverse childhood experiences score of 4 or more out of 10. And I think many of you may be familiar with ACEs. And if not, there's a handout that Charmaine will be sending to you where I have the questionnaire and the 10 items that are in the ACEs. But having an ACE score of even just 2 points is actually enough to be associated in research studies with an increased risk of autoimmune diseases and other chronic illnesses. And so hers was 4, which is pretty significant. She also was able to make more sense from this big trauma perspective about the events that happened before onset, and that the events were not traumatic per se, and they don't have to be. The event that triggers the onset, it could be traumatic, it could be stressful, but it may just be a last straw event. And for me, it had been all of these emotional components had been involved in a number of events that happened before she got sick. One of them was that her partner had had a pretty serious bicycle accident, and it had really triggered a lot of things in her, including fear of what could happen to him and what might happen to them as a couple. And those things tend to link back to the babyhood and childhood traumatic experiences that she'd had. So, opportunities for prevention. I know, Susan, last week you were talking about if I had known that I was going to develop rheumatoid arthritis, I would have meditated for all this time period beforehand. And meditation, this is just a little brief digression, but meditation may be able to do that for some people, to work through, integrate old traumas. And I think for a lot of us, it can actually be overwhelming. I know for myself, when I worked with meditation as a tool, it actually triggered my own experiences of aloneness as a child. Here you are sitting on your own, whether you're in a group or not, but you're sitting with your own stuff and you're working to differentiate and not get pulled into it, which is how we work through trauma. But I found that it was actually quite triggering for me when I was meditating. So one of the ways to think about prevention is our own awareness that we have experienced past trauma and that we may be experiencing symptoms that are known to be linked to trauma even before chronic illness, such as depression and anxiety, which are the 2 most common symptoms of trauma. But looking back, the more we know about our own trauma in a way and how it could show up, the more opportunities we have to work through those and how they're showing up in our lives in the present. So ultimately, healing trauma is about telling the brain that it's over. And that happens by completing things that could have happened if we hadn't been forced into a place of freeze or helplessness because of the circumstances. So I'll just bring this together for today's conclusion, which is that ultimately things that you're already doing are all tools that help work with trauma. And some of them may be new, like working with sensation. But ultimately, it's sort of having our own internal ideal parent as one way to relate to our chronic illness and to bring compassion with it. But also this concept about meditation, the component of it that involves mindfulness is something that we can bring into our daily life. And I find that it seems in chronic illness that what we're developing are lifelong skills for a lifelong practice, and that's part of how we keep working with symptoms, including having a high index of suspicion, looking for triggers, and then what to work with. And so as we do this, we can begin to catch flares earlier. We may be able to anticipate them and maybe even do things to prevent them. Sometimes, for example, in preparation for a trip to visit family, you know that you may be at greater risk for flare-ups when you're with family. And so maybe you set it up differently, a shorter amount of time or more resources, or visiting friends when you're with family. So understanding these patterns and the trauma can really begin to help us work with the flares, including nipping them in the bud when they do arise, or being able to hang out with them with more capacity when they do happen and last for a while. So ultimately, what I see trauma bringing in is helpful for context and working with symptoms And also our own work and our own healing can help us reduce the risk of passing on some of these traumas to our kids, which is a really challenging topic because it's not about blame. It's really how do we work through the multi-generational experiences that our society is not yet really naming or aware of. And so ultimately there too, I think of these as adding more empowering tools to the process that may be able to slow a disease progress or process down, potentially stabilize. Some people do recover fully. And the extent to which we can recover, I don't know. This may be wisdom that we've lost and that we're having to learn from scratch in a way again. But I found also with my own health and working with clients that working with the trauma really can make a very significant difference. So the links I sent, Charmaine had sent you a lot of links last week. I hope it wasn't overwhelming. I wanted you guys to have a lot of choices. And I'm adding just a few links this time that Charmaine will send. One is the links to the podcast, One Broken Mom, that Ami has done, and also to the blog post. There's also blog posts on working with symptoms, and you'll see all the different options for all the different types of blog posts, and some of them may resonate more. And I just talk about different tips for how we can work with the things in our everyday life. There's also a fact sheet that I just created, and it's about autoimmune disease and trauma. And the front page of the fact sheet summarizes the research and the symptoms and what we know about autoimmune diseases, antibodies, trauma patterns, events in childhood. And then on the back of that sheet, if you were to print it as a two-sider, you could have a bunch of references. There's a one page of references on that backside. And I've developed a number of fact sheets for a few reasons. One is it can really be validating to just have it in black and white and to have the references there for ourselves. But it can also be a way to educate your doctor. As doctors, we really like the hard science, the medical science that supports this. So I know some of you have been telling your health professionals about this for a long time. And this could be another example of a way to support your arguments and what you know. And it can also be helpful with family and friends as well. And then I would really love to invite you guys to take the surveys I have on my blog. There's a link to the surveys, and I have about 3 of them up right now. There's one called the background survey where you can add your health conditions. And at this point, I have about 170 autoimmune diseases on that list, along with other chronic symptoms. And adding that, and then looking and doing the other surveys, the babyhood events surveys, childhood surveys. I'm actually doing this to keep learning more for myself, but that this could be something I can use in talks. And maybe in the future, if I'm able to publish, that could be part of publishing to keep educating people from a very informed group of people with chronic illness. So even though we have some of this information, there's so much that we don't know and that isn't being looked at. So I invite you, I would love it if you did the surveys. So this is the blog post with Ami with 16 clues. And also email me through my blog, or Charmaine, you can send my email if you have some questions that we can't get to today.